Welcome to it's 1 o'clock UTC presentation, and I don't have a room captain, so it's going to be me talking about what I've done. I'm not going to talk about my history because that was what yesterday's opening session was about. But today's presentation, what I'm going to talk about is this messy world of diving. The world we live in is messy. We've got rules, we've got processes, we've got procedures. We've got guidelines, we've got an understanding of what these should be followed. And, they don't always align with what we're actually going to do in the real world. And Daryl's presentation earlier, talking about running a dive center, highlighted a number of those conflicts and pressures that exist. Now, this presentation will focus on a number of those key areas, some key concepts to help you navigate that messy world. And to a certain extent, also understand why things happen the way they do, and it's not black and white. And unfortunately, the more that you look at this, the grayer and the more blurred it becomes, and that makes it a little bit harder to understand what's happening. I'm also going to introduce a couple of bits that we've done recently in terms of research, which are still developmental, so these aren't final results, but it's to give you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of myself and the collaborative organizations moving on to the world of messy world of a human diver. So the first example I'm going to talk about is, and this is one that came out from a survey that I put together. It was a fairly common theme that was out there, looking at controlled emergency swimming ascents or when you've got limited visibility. So the agencies have got standards which cover supervision numbers, the levels that are there, and they provide numerical limits in which they're supposed to be followed. And so the idea is that, an unqualified diver, say an open water diver, shouldn't be on their own because they're not certified, they're not able to operate as an autonomous diver. These are absolute numbers, but the problem is that visibility can be a limiting factor in this stage. And what is done, because you can't be prescriptive, is that they leave the options of what is acceptable visibility to the instructor to judge on the day. Now, in certain areas, now the UK is one of them, and Jenny just talked about just now diving on the Kiara as coming from a sort of Middle East location where you've got not quite unlimited visibility, but pretty close, to coming to diving in the UK where you've got pretty poor visibility, can be dark as well, especially in the winter when we've got short days. Now, that means that your certified professionals have to stay close to your students. Now, if the dive shop management doesn't provide enough certified assistants to manage this, the instructor has to make some pretty serious decisions on the day. Now, a single instructor with 2 assistants can manage 8 divers in the water. That's one of the training standards for an agency that's out there. Now, that means that you can keep a certified assistant with the students underwater, and you can be in the water column somewhere else or on the surface. So they're always going to have people that are around you. And you can do that class relatively efficiently. Now, what happens is if a instructor has got 8 students, which is allowed, it means that then you end up with running multiple activities. Now, it means that most of the students have to be left on the shore. That could be cold, it could be it is time consuming. It's not very efficient at all. And it also means that the instructors are pretty tired because they're going to be swimming back and forth all the time. So it's not an effective way to do things. Now, what happens if that instructor goes to meet his students and they're going to do a Caesar activity, but then they're in a situation where actually this shop hasn't given them the assistance to manage it? How does the instructor deal with that? Now, you could turn around and say, well, they shouldn't undertake that activity, but now you end up with commercial pressures. You've got reputational risk. You've got to manage the customer, your client, as best you can, because it's all about trying to get repeat business. Repeat business is easier than trying to get new clients that come in. Now, if you go and do this as a single activity, and I know speaking to a number of instructors out there, they were taught by their instructor trainer or whatever they're called in that agency at the time, that you have a choice. You can do the Caesar activities with all of your students on the surface. Now there's a potential for them to drift off, or you can do it with the students stuck on the bottom. Now that leaves them in a pretty poor position because the instructor might be on the surface and the divers are on the bottom. Now, you could just sit there and go, well, that's against the rules. You go, well, yes, it's against the standards. But how are the instructors, taught about this? And this, this instructor that I was speaking to said, her instructor trainer had said, this is for you to manage. It's up to you to manage that risk, which is great until something goes wrong. And then what happens is they'll go through the compliance and go, did you follow this standard? Did you leave a diver on their own submerged? Yes. Breach standards, it's all your fault. But what we're trying to understand is that there are these tensions all the time. And that's really a little bit about what I'm going to talk about is the first part of the presentation, the tensions. In fact, I'll go through what, this summary there bit is, the instructor's manual, the instruction manual of what should happen versus the reality of the financial, the time pressures. And in fact, Jenny's last presentation talking with Laura in the Q&A, talking about increasing the time or stopping the activity so that people get better. But then that's the commercial pressures and the way that activities are marketed saying, yes, we can take part in this. So the other bit is, are we being compliant with the process or are we being compliant with the outcome that we're looking for? Because if we're just totally wedded to being compliant to the process and it doesn't add value to the diver, it might add value to the organization. Is it meaningless compliance? And there's a whole presentation that can be done on the difference between meaningless and meaningful compliance. And then the final piece is, a lot of what we're talking about, and I questioned Daryl about, is the risk management aspects of running a dive center. Now, are you being operationally safe? Or are you being safe from litigation? Or in Daryl's case, Sharia law, that's it. Your name is on the card. You're the responsible grown-up that basically if something goes wrong, you're it. So now operationally safe and safe from litigation don't necessarily line up as the same things. And that's a bit that sort of we don't talk to. I don't believe that the diving industry really discusses in a lot of great detail to the instructors, and certainly the ones I've spoken to when this isn't something, these tensions aren't the things that we are covering. So what I'm going to talk about is those tensions to start with between safety, workload and money, and using a published research model that's out there. Next, I'm going to talk about organizational drift and how and why those sorts of things talk about. Now, Bart yesterday talked about normalization of deviance and drift, and it is normal. It is totally normal because humans are trying to be as efficient as possible. And it is only when we have something like an adverse outcome that is noticed or noticeable that we start to look a little bit deeper. And unfortunately, that's normally when the lawyers get involved, especially if it's a serious injury or a fatality, and trying to understand the background behind that. I'm also going to talk about some of the gaps that have come through from some research that I started and yet to finish the paper on, just to say that, this stuff is real. It's not just some theoretical bits about gaps and how we manage it. These are the real problems that dive instructors have to manage, and agencies and dive center managers need to be cognizant of. And we'll talk about how to address some of those. And that really comes into the final piece of the presentation, which is about unraveling the tangled web that we sit in. We are in a complex environment. And as a consequence, we have to be able to understand, how can we start to straighten this stuff? We're never going to get to a totally safe environment. And Valerie's presentation yesterday about prevention is not enough. We need to look at some of the resilience engineering stuff that's come out there as well and apply that. So if you haven't seen Valerie's presentation, I'd go and recommend getting that. So tensions within the system, and this model framework comes from Cook and Rasmussen in a paper that they wrote in terms of going solid in the healthcare system. And whilst it's written about healthcare, it is equally applicable to the diving space. In fact, it's applicable to anywhere that's got some form of commercial entity or commercial activity, because there's money is involved. So the way that this framework or this model is put together is that each one of those lines, the black and the red and the blue lines, describe failures. That's where we collapse for different reasons. So from the black line, it's about economic failure. This is where we don't have enough money to undertake the activity. Now, in diving, which is from the majority of people, it's a discretionary activity, which means that we allow a certain amount of our budget to go onto this activity. Now, it could be for a dive center where, Daryl was talking about, I've got to make sure the book's balanced, otherwise we go bust. So we've got this economic failure boundary that's there. The blue line is the boundary to acceptable workload. And it's like, well, we can't do it. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough people. And how do we manage that? We would like to, as I talked about the example earlier of doing a Caesar, well, you just get a dive master or an assistant with you. It's like, yeah, but we don't have those. Well, why not? Well, because we can't afford to pay the dive masters, because then our course prices would go up, which means we're now no longer competitive to the rest of the dive centers that are around. And because the clients, the students don't know what they don't know, they will just look at the cheapest option that's out there. And it literally is a drive to the bottom when it comes to cost. So we've got, economic and we've got workload activities. For an individual diver, I'm trying to be as efficient as possible. I don't want to apply lots of work. The fact that you're all in this seminar, this conference is fantastic. But it requires time and effort on your part to do this. You've got to learn it. And I'll cover a little bit more about this in the final presentation today. And then the red line on the left-hand side of this is the boundary of basically unsafe or functionally acceptable performance. You cross that, you have an accident. Something seriously goes wrong. Now, the difficulty with that red line is we don't know where it exists. We can probably work out what the economic failure line is. We could probably work out the workload because, there's a fixed number of hours and, in the day, and we've got to eat and we've got to drink and all sorts of things like that. We've got to have rest. Safety is a bit of a nebulous topic and, described with somebody the other day. Safety as being a dynamic non-event. If you are safe, nothing bad happens. Which means that, all of these things that are creating safety, we don't see the outcome because we haven't seen the negative aspects. Now, we have an error margin. We try to build some fat into the system to make sure that we don't fail. But the thing is that, that's where we think failure is. Now, it could be aligned exactly with the red line, or it could be backed off, depending on how risk-seeking or risk-averse you are as an individual or as an entity, as an organization or an agency. That error margin is what we're trying to, we build into the system, but we don't know where things are. Now, the pressures and the tensions that are in place are, from a management side. Now, this could be your dive center manager, it could be the agency, it could be about, what you're being rewarded for in terms of the number of certifications, your kudos that's associated with that. And what that's doing is it's moving us up in the top left quadrant. What we're talking about there is we're moving us towards unsafety. We're moving us towards that error margin, but we don't know where it is. At the same time, we've got the financial pressures, and you sit there and go, right, we're going to push us towards unsafety again. And that might be extending the service intervals between getting our equipment serviced. It might be about increasing the number of divers that are on a training course because we need to get people through. And I would think with people coming out of COVID in the last 6 months, and I know some places are still totally locked down, that financial pressure will certainly drive behaviors towards the left of the model. And in fact, there was a story on the Facebook Scuba Accidents and Risk Management group talking about a liveaboard in the Galapagos Islands where failures had happened on that equipment because they hadn't serviced equipment, because it was this bit of, yeah, it'll be okay. It hasn't failed yet. And if we service it proactively, that costs us additional money. So we have those tensions, management, and the pressures towards least effort and least money. And then we have stuff that goes back the other way. People like me, people like Dan, the British Aqua Club, Paddy, the organizations who put safety materials out there. And it's like, oh, here we go, safety, boring. And I'm used to it, but people, when I pitch up a dive site, oh, got your clipboard then, Gareth? It's like, really? this isn't about the safety aspects. This is about trying to improve performance. So we have these campaigns that push that sort of the dot in the center back towards a point where things are in equilibrium. We're trying to make things as equal as possible. Now that's difficult. That's difficult to understand that. And as Daryl identified in his dive center, and I know that DAN Europe have got a HIRA program, and in fact it's done in DAN worldwide now, we're actually starting to look at internal reporting and managing risks that are going on. So how well is the system operating in the way it should do? So that's the sort of the tensions that exist within an organization or as individuals. We're trying to balance those. Now, when they start to get unbalanced for a while and you start to erode the safety margins, what we end up is organizational drift. And say Bart touched on this normalization of deviance yesterday in Diane Vaughan's work. And this framework here that I'm just going to describe comes from sort of modern safety, differently safety 2 world, and looking at how we create safety within an organization and then what happens to that. So we start off we've got a couple of axes on this graph. The first bit is time on the bottom as time progresses. And the vertical axis is, sort of a nebulous topic that says how we do stuff around here and how do we create safety. Now, the first bit that we do is we have this concept called work as imagined or work as prescribed. And this is how organizational management leadership put processes in place that says, I can sleep safely at night. This is putting in risk management processes, risk and method statements. It could be about servicing your equipment. It could be about training courses. It could be about when you bring a new staff member in, your induction process. So we have a whole bunch of these things, these processes, rules, procedures, training standards. We've got a quality control department that's there. And the idea is that as long as they're adhering to those standards, we're safe. But the reality of those things I've already touched on is that they're never 100% complete. So there's always going to be a margin. And, some agencies are better than others when it comes to the quality of their materials and the gaps that might be present. So you already start below that 100% line, and people start to interact and they start to innovate. And what happens is that drift, they move away from the baseline and the sort of the dip and then the brief spike about a quarter of the way in is just to signify that somebody's had a close scare. They've had a near miss and they've gone, ooh, that was close. Let's go back to what we should be following that's going on. And at the same time, we could be in a situation where we've got, so they're managing that drift as they go along. They're creating safety all the time, because if they weren't creating safety, then we would have lots more accidents that are going on. At the same time, we have people who are innovating, that they're coming up with good ideas. And in fact, those could be, I'm going to say safer, they could be higher performing, they could be better than that which the standards are written out. Now, if we've got some form of feedback, which is something that Valerie talked about with her propeller bow tie model, is you've got to have some form of feedback within the system to help you understand, hang on a minute, how are people doing this? How are they managing those tensions? And it might be that they're coming up with some great ideas, which we could then pass on to the rest of, if it's a training agency, the rest of the instructors. If it's a dive center, does one of those instructors or one of those boat guys, and Daryl was talking about this earlier as well, you've got some people who are doing some fantastic work. How do we bottle that and then sell it on or pass it on to other people? Now, at the same time as we have people who are, I'm going to say, drifting, because there isn't a way of capturing this, they're not having effective feedback within the system. You've also got things going on the outside. You've got accumulations, and that might be old equipment. It might be the boats need to be serviced, they need to be replaced. It could be that actually the maritime code has changed, or it could be the Coast Guard rules. It could be the training agency have moved on in terms of what they believe to be important and the standards that need to be developed. Now, that gap between accumulations and the work as done line, the blue line, is that capacity to fail safely. So it's this bit that basically says, yeah, that's what the standard is, that's what the rules are that I'm following, but this is what I'm doing, and these accumulations are the threats that are coming out that I'm trying to manage all of those spinning plates or juggling balls where we've got to manage the workload, we've got to manage the financial side, because what we don't want to do is have an accident. And that accident occurs where we end up with the accumulations line and the work is done line crossing. Now, when that happens, the immediate response is normally, who's to blame? And it's about finding out what has happened and how do we identify the individual. Now, the sort of the traditional way of looking at that is so we can prevent it again. Now, the modern safety view that basically says if you start to point at an individual rather than looking at a system, you're not going to get a complete story. And there's a number of presentations I've done on the Just Culture framework that allows people to understand those things. And in fact, Diane's whole presentation, the second one yesterday morning, was about moving from a blame focus to a learning focus. Because the point is, if you stopped time 5 seconds before that accident happened, you could use hindsight in your benefit. You could look backwards. You wouldn't have had an accident, but you're still going to have all of the information. So between the work is done, the work is imagined line, the stuff that's written down, and the work is done, you've got a whole bunch of data and information and knowledge about how people are creating safety dynamically against the standards that are there. At the same time, if you look at between the red line and the bottom axes, you've got an idea about where your system is failing. So the need to learn doesn't have to be because you've had an accident. It requires a change in attitudes to say, you know what, people are managing these tensions all the time. The difference between work is imagined and work is done is real. And I've got some slides that will talk about that in a minute. Now, how do we go about finding those gaps? And that's what this next framework is this little model is going to talk about. Is, we've got this work as imagined. So taking the diving context, we've got an effective and safe diver training program. We've got a set of training materials for the diver. We've got a set of training materials for the instructor development process. And those should have been developed with frontline instructors to understand the tensions and pressures that are there. Now, what happens there is you then document that. You've got an idea of what you want, and now what you do is you encode it and you put it into the training materials. You put it into online, could be hard copy. Now, the problem with hard copy stuff is actually stuff gets updated and it costs money to reissue those. Now, here's a benefit for some of the training agencies, because now you can make money out of updated materials. Now, here's the tension. Do I update my materials, which costs me money, or do I just use out-of-date stuff because I don't have to spend that, and I can then be cheaper than the next dive center down the road? Or it could be actually, I don't believe what's written in the training materials because they aren't staying up with modern research and activities. So we've got this work as prescribed, which is the codified idea of work as imagined. Now, you can't write down everything that you think you want to write down because you have to simplify it. It's got to be potentially globally applicable. And if you produced a book this thick, then nobody's going to actually follow it. So there is a tension here. Again, what do those document sets look like? Now, you then give that document set, that work as prescribed, to your instructor trainers, to your instructors, who then deliver it to the clients, the students, as they come through their courses. Now, how do we find out the gap between what is really done and what somebody tells you it's being done? So there's two frames here. There's work as recounted. So if I go to a dive center as part of a quality control or an instructor trainer, and I'll say, can you tell me what you do? How do you run this class? And depending on psychological safety and just culture, they will give you an idea of what's going on. If they have a really, in fact, I'll just click the next bit. If we've got strong psychological safety and we've got a good, just culture, so we recognize that people will err, that they will make mistakes, that they are always trying to do the best they can with the resources they've got, we're going to have a gap here. So if we've got a punitive culture, that if we go in there and say, tell me what you do, and if, by the way, if you're breaching the standards, we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks, then actually I'm going to tell you exactly what's in the documentation. We bring a couple of dive masters along and we can run 8-person classes based on that. But if I have if we've created a really strong psychologically safe environment, a strong just culture, so that people will be able to talk about these things, and that includes the rules that get broken. If I go up to that same instructor, but he's got a different operating environment, I can say to him, okay, John, how do you run this scenario? Well, you know what? It's really difficult because the financial tensions are here. We can't afford to have a couple of dive masters. So what I do is I manage it by doing X, Y, and Z. Now, I, as within the organization, now are learning what's going on. So one of the premises that I talked about first thing yesterday morning, human factors, is about making it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. What is it that I can do to design a system to make it safer and easier to execute in a safe manner? So again, this is why I got Diane in here to talk about just culture, and Dave Conlin's going to talk about it as well, is on the next presentation, is it supports learning within an organization. So what I did was I wanted to find out what the gaps were that are out there in reality. And I put a Typeform database out there, a Typeform questionnaire. I only opened it for 2 weeks because I wanted people to provide some stuff. I had 431 people start and 238 people responded out of that. And it was all done confidentially, and those contact details are now removed. So I don't know who those people are. This was the breakdown. And the reason why it says 18% neither is because even though I put the instructions out that said it's only applicable for instructors and instructor trainers and course directors, I still had people starting it and going, oh, no, I'm not. So that's fine. Filtered it out. This is the sort of diving that they took place, predominantly recreational, and it doesn't add up to 100% because there's some other little bits beyond, but this gives you an idea that it was predominantly recreational space, and that's not surprising given the stratification of the diving instructional community. And more than 76% had more than 250 instructional dives. So these weren't fresh instructors. There was a big bias towards experience, which was great. Now, the next few slides are going to give you some extracts, the narrative extracts that are there. What I want to do is start to give some sort of quantitative data so you can see the sort of factors that are involved. So this was one. I find it difficult to get the class done, open water and nitrox, done in 4 days, because otherwise I end up bulldozing through the materials. And you know what? I'm not quite sure whether or not people understand and have that retained knowledge, which goes to this ambiguous definition of mastery of a skill. The mastery should be that you do it so that you don't get it wrong even when under stress conditions. Now, what that stressing is really dependent on the environment. So stress as an open water diver is very different to stress when you're an advanced rebreather diver, hypoxic trimix. Now, the non-italic text is what were the reasons why. So pressure from the dive shop to get it done in 4 days or less, because they will back courses up against each other. And so there's very little fat in the system, because if you have a down day, you're not making money. So there's a tension that says, I need to make money out of much of this, and I've got workload, and that's pushing things to the red line in that little framework. Standards aren't very exacting, so it's a judgment call as to whether the student has made it or not. As a new instructor, I was taught that level of basic skill fulfillment, awareness, the ability to remain still, trim, etc., weren't evaluated. So I only have learnt that from teaching with others and seeing their standards. And this is a lack of training of instructor trainers. And that's another workload stroke financial consideration, because if you create lots of instructor trainers or course directors, you've got to have courses to run, which means you've got to have candidate instructors who might not be there. So you're in a situation there which again is driving things towards the red line. Time constraints as imposed by the dive centre, leading to rushed and adequate training only, turning out a diver that ticks the boxes but only just. So that's potentially meaningless compliance. The conveyor belt or machine attitude of some dive centres that are focused solely on money and numbers. And now this, competition's great, but if your students don't know what they don't know, the natural response is they're all labelled the same training agencies. Therefore, why should, and there is a working assumption, as you would do, that they're all trained the same way. And that's not the case. So what we have, we've got to do some education for the divers who are coming in saying, I want to learn a new course. How do we educate those novice divers to understand what should be the assessment? The instructor development course or instructor exam gives the impression that the instructor will always have time to give herself fully to the students. The reality is they're working tired, they're under pressure to finish a course as soon as possible in order to start the next. So again, we're back to those tensions. A good example of this is at the out-of-air drill. What I see being taught is according to the book, but unrealistic in an emergency. Now, there will be a reason why those drills are developed the way they are, not just because of the technical efficacy in a real out-of-gas situation, but it's also what can you teach to your students and to your instructors if you're an instructor trainer. What we'd like is ultimately, really optimal, safe system, but then people might not remember what it is. Instructors tend to follow the book to the letter and rush to complete the course without real thought to actual emergencies. Now, I get that, there's a lot of negative stuff, and I've only given a few examples here. There are a lot more in there, and there were some positive, innovative drift that was taking place as well. Now, one of the things that I wanted to understand was, how would the agencies find out? And an agency was questioned on a couple of them saying, do you mean dive center or do you mean training agency? Because there are different approaches to this sort of thing. Now, what I was talking about was actually the agency as in a training agency rather than a dive center, but the concepts still apply. So they would wait for an accident and then blame the instructor for not using the proper judgment. And Diane was talking about, let's understand the context. Why is it that people are not following things? We've got to take that systems approach. No idea. Accident reports of instructors are good enough to fill them out. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. And Frauke discussed the challenges of diver incident reporting system and near misses yesterday of trying to collect enough context-rich data that helps, but that takes time. So again, we're in this sort of tension, this efficiency, thoroughness trade-off that's going on. Potentially in course feedback forms from the student, although this may require the student to have a better knowledge of the specific standards. They don't know what they don't know. Also reporting by other instructors or course bosses at regional events, although many of the workarounds are tacitly accepted or passed on even by senior instructors. So Daryl talked about this bit where you've got staff coming in and then they go out. The lessons that are passed on, the drift that's present, you don't know that drift is happening. So we've got to have some form of effective feedback to capture what's going on. With the quality assurance systems that exist today, the student is only questioned about basic standards requirements, and that might not always be enough to detect a gap with work as imagined versus work as done. So the only way that the organization will find out is if I'm deviating that much from the work as imagined, that I end up breaking a standard, and then I've deviated a lot more from where I should have been. Now, you can deviate a long way from a standard and still not have an accident. So there is this bit that says, yeah, I'm going to deviate, but what we have to have is an adverse outcome. And what I'm trying to say from that organizational drift model is that you don't have to have an accident to be able to start, shining a spotlight on certain areas. What it does require is an attitude change that says drift is there and it's real. So this one here is they don't really care about the gap. The final responsibility lays with the certifying instructor. Organizations do not certify. They make rules, guidelines, and the necessary products, so course materials, etc., to reinforce their position in the market. There are no laws that rule diving. I think in some places there are. You do not need a license to practice, but it is better if you have one. Directly or indirectly, breaking a standard consciously or unconsciously is seen as something bad. And this, again, ties in with Diane's piece of we've got to educate people about standards and about human error and the drift that happens, and look to the system and the behaviors that are there. A human error is an unintended deviation from a preferred behavior. Now, that preferred behavior is my preferred behavior. Now, it could and should align with the organization's preferred behaviors, but it might not. So when you are looking in, then it's very easy to judge that that preferred behavior was incorrect. So we go back to this framework, and this works at an organizational level, and it works at an individual level as well. So, how do we go about unraveling those tangles that are there? Start off with, I just hit on it just now, recognition and acknowledgement of human error. And I purposely put error in inverted commas, because you can only determine error after the event. Because, as I said, if it's my preferred behavior, I only know that I'm going to, it's happened afterwards. If I knew that I was going to make a slip, a lapse, or a mistake beforehand, I would have done something about it. And even violations are often subject to organizational influences. So in Simon's piece first thing this morning, it's this violation is a separate category, and it's this choice. But often the choices we have are subject to external influences, and Diane touched on these yesterday. Creating and maintaining psychological safety. This is hard. It's about putting yourself out there and saying, I don't have the answers, that I make mistakes. I'll talk about those. It's about making yourself vulnerable psychologically to your environment. It's this shared belief within the group, the team, the organization, that it is okay to take an interpersonal risk. And the challenge here is, if I speak up, the results are seen right now. But if I don't speak up, then the results might never be seen. And if they do, well, they could be much further on. And if you go to watch If Only, you'll see Barbara as one of the students on the class talking about her inability to speak up at that time as a lack of psychological safety. Developing a just culture through strong leadership, and I've referred to Diane a fair amount. And the paper, and in fact, all of the papers from all of the presentations, that the reference materials will be available in the recordings piece that's there. Now, the bit that says strong leadership is because you can't do this bottom up. You have to create it top down. And that means getting the stakeholders, the lawyers, the accident investigation people, the leadership within the training organizations, the research organizations, academia, to look at this and say, how do we create this manually? It's not easy, definitely, but it is massively worthwhile. At a local level, what can you do? You can brief and debrief to learn in real time. And this is a framework that I teach in my training classes, the debrief model. And somebody talked about it yesterday, and I've forgotten, really apologize for that. Going through how do you learn from this? And the benefit of a debrief is that you learn from this last event. And importantly, you now build your situation awareness for the next event. In fact, it was Guy's presentation about teamwork and applying human factors to technical diving programs. Incident reporting and learning reviews. And I purposely changed the language here because I did used to have learning investigations, but investigation has a negative connotation. And this is work that I'm doing with 3 organizations at the moment to better understand what the reporting systems are and how they're managed. Because at the moment, there are lots of these. And if you're involved in an organization that has an incident reporting system, expect a contact fairly soon to say, look, what have you got? How does it work? How's it stored? What are the sort of numbers involved? So we've got an idea of what the status quo of the current system is. And what we'd really like is something like the US Forest Service learning reviews, where they moved from a blame-focused approach for the serious accident investigation boards, and they moved to learning reviews. Their litigation dropped to almost zero. Their learning went through the roof because they created an environment that says, tell us what you do. They're trying to close that gap between work as imagined and work as done. And that wasn't about forcing people to come up to here. It could have been about actually changing work as imagined or work as prescribed so that it is easier to comply with and actually get the execution done. Next bit about network of influence mapping, understanding why people do what they did. And I ran a little research session about 3 weeks ago with 9 divers, with Ivan Papilidi from the US, who used to be in the Forest Service, and understanding what influences divers to do what they did. And this is from a paper that he and Krista have produced that basically shows how do networks appear. And they ran a couple of sessions, very similar sessions, and they came up with the same framework in the center. And the idea is you end up with a data collect like this, which is what we did 3 weeks ago. One of those was what influences divers to make the decisions they do, and one of them was what influences divers to take the risks they do. And out of the 2 sessions in 3 hours, we created 450 post-it notes. The risks one was about 150 and the decisions was 300 or so. And the idea is to put together a paper that's based on this. And what we end up doing is trying to synthesize these ideas into some categories. And then the idea is that after a number of incidents, you look at this and then you can start to collect metadata and understand what are the factors that we really need to be paying attention to, not focusing on outcomes. Outcomes are really limited when it comes to learning. What we have to understand is that influences that they're going into the system. So, in terms of summary, those tensions are always going to be there. So we need to acknowledge them and design the systems, the training systems as we go along. Acknowledgement and recognition that people within systems are not linear in their actions. I know we like talking about the chain of events, but in reality, you could have stuff from left field all coming together. Incidents, accidents are caused by a convergence of factors or an emergence of an adverse event. Just because you think you can identify those, that's really influenced by hindsight bias. The chances of you encountering exactly those same situations again, pretty slim, really. So we've got to look at the influences that are going on. Understand the conditions that are leading to drift and address those. Telling people to pay more attention, to be more careful, is not going to help. And the learning is essential. It needs there, to support that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of today in the final closing session. But we have to have a good understanding about what's going on, and it shouldn't be blame focused. And that takes me to the questions. So if you've got any questions, please jump into the I have a question room and can bring you onto stage. Oh, it's quiet. Oh, it's this the bit here. So, ideas. Sorry, go on, Daryl. I'll bring you up. Brilliant. Thank you. Daryl, it's gone dark from where you were before.
Yes, the sun's going down. Quick question: the big post-it note exercise that you did. When are you going to share? When are you going to share some of that?
So that is the first iteration at the moment. So the next activity is for me to, from my perspective, I will then start to aggregate those. That was a first pass. The idea is that you start aggregating that data, you synthesize that data, and then it starts to populate those 8 or so categories. Now, it might be that when you start doing that, some of the things might not fit in those. So it might be there's another category. So the idea is that I will go through those, populate as best I can for the risk one to start with, and then go back to the 8 stakeholders that we had, which was actually from Europe and the States, and it was covering different perspective, recreational, technical, and commercial diving. So then it's to go back to them to validate, and then we'll start putting that out there. So as soon as I can, but you'll see what else is going on when I do the closing presentation. So it was a fascinating exercise. I think most people were like, oh my God, there is so much stuff that's there.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Daryl. I'll bring Andres up. Hello. Right. What's the question, Andres?
All right. me coming from the more practical side and like asking questions from the previous part of from your presentation, what would you suggest for the approaching dive center? And I tell them about the human factors, and I tell them about the approach to human factors, and they tell me, well, you worked here, you know how it is, you know the tension between and the struggle between the economics and the things we can do and what we do around here. So what would you suggest to be more practical approach, or what can be the key points that could be given them to begin the change right away?
It's a great question, Andres, and I get that there are those tensions there. So start off with just take that little model and just the 3 bits of workload, money, and safety, and then you sit there and go, right, how do you manage this? And how do you know where the safety line is? So start a general awareness of the tensions that exist and get them to acknowledge that those tensions exist. Now, I would also then refer back to, I don't know if you saw Valerie's presentation yesterday morning talking about prevention is not enough. An understanding of what's going to kill me, and what are we doing to manage that, and is it enough? So there's 3 simple questions you can add there. And I would also add to that is any of the risk management risk control or mitigation measures that they've got in place, have they ever validated them? Have they actually gone and run a simulation or run an exercise that basically says, yeah, if we've got a DCS on a boat or a trip, or if we have an injury, if we've got a lost diver, all right, what do we do? Well, we have these protocols. Okay, when was the last time you actually ran through them? So what you're trying to do is, talk about that work as imagine, work as done. Work as imagine, we've got some protocols. Work as done. When was the last time you actually did it? Well, we haven't. So how do you know that protocol will work? Well, and so those would be a couple of things to get them. Now, if they're not in that learning frame of saying, actually, we are managing risk effectively and we haven't had an accident, I would then refer to other high risk industries like healthcare, aviation, oil and gas, or even something like the firefighting teams. Something that Ivan said yesterday is, well, often they would get done by the US OSHA, their health and safety people, for a general clause that said they were not managing risk effectively. And it's like, hang on a minute, we're fighting wildland fires. We are in a risky environment. So we are going to deal with this all the time. When we fail, which is the point that Valerie's question made yesterday, not if, when we fail, how do we fail safely? And it has to be some difficult questions. Now, if they turn around and say, so be it, so be it. There's only so much you can do when it comes to leading a horse to water.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. Right. If anybody has any other questions, come and see me in the lobby, Hall 1. I've only got until about 5:02 because I'm room captaining the next one. So if you want to have a chat, go for it. Otherwise, you will be on the top of the hour, which is with Dave Conlin, looking at a just culture from inside and how bureaucracy responded to a dive accident. And having seen this and the novel approach that Dave's taken to explain what happened to his incident, I think it is well worthwhile, and it ties in with so many of the other presentations we've had. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all on the top of the hour.